So last weekend, Andrew did his review of the CrinEar Reference, and it was more of an in-depth, focused kind of review solely about the reference itself. So this weekend we had talked about doing a more comparison-centric review where it's reference versus a whole bunch of stuff. And after filming it twice and thinking about it, I don't really think it's that interesting of an idea for a video, because it's basically just me for 20 minutes saying CrinEar Reference has less bass and treble, therefore it's better, which just isn't very entertaining and doesn't really tell you guys much that you couldn't just see on a measurement. So today, instead, what I want to do is take us through a chronology of neutral IEMs and talk about why most of them weren't actually neutral, the journey that brought us to here, because it wasn't a linear one and it wasn't one without issues, and talk about the reason a lot of the discourse around the reference and the idea of neutral IEMs is profoundly disappointing. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. For any discussion around neutral, I think we first need to talk about what that means to people and how they actually understand the term. And the first thing I want to talk about here is actually something that is not neutral, which is Beats by Dre. I think the sound signature being so firmly and unapologetically bass forward was something that was new to a lot of consumers. That this was the case meant that when Beats by Dre became popular, it made a lot of people think differently about what they wanted in their music. For normal consumers, it was, just a situation where they now had bass in their headphones and they were like, oh, this is nice. I want that. However, in the audiophile sphere and in the pro audio sphere, this kind of widespread acceptance of fairly prominent bass responses prompted kind of a knee-jerk reactionary response wherein the audiophiles and the pro audio, the people who are serious about sound quality, didn't have any interest in that. Not because they didn't see the value in bass extension or bass presence, but because they felt like forward bass was pedestrian or unserious. And this led to kind of a fracturing where in the minds of a lot of consumers, including people who are quite serious about audio, there ended up being only two sound signatures functionally, which was bass and neutral. And I know this sounds like an oversimplification because it is, but as someone that was interested in headphones and buying headphones in this time period, that is absolutely how I thought about things. And this kind of led to a lot of the headphones that actually came out that didn't have prominent bass responses being able to market themselves as neutral with complete uncritical acceptance from the consumer base, whether they were audiophiles, pro audio people, or consumers. The simplest version of what I'm saying here is that in the early days of headphones as a serious consumer market, the only thing people needed to accept something marketed as neutral or talked about as neutral online, the only thing they needed to accept that was neutral was that it didn't have a massive bass emphasis. A lot of my early purchasing habits when it comes to headphones and IEMs were entirely based on and justified by this calculus. Like one of the first open back headphones I bought, and I bought it for mixing music, was the Beyerdynamic DT990. If you watch this program often, you may know that is not a neutral headphone by any stretch. It's an incredibly bright headphone, but when I took it home and started listening to it, I didn't hear a massive cloying bass emphasis that would be present on something like the Beats by Dre or on the gaming headsets that I had had experience with up to that point. So that's all I needed to accept that this was a neutral headphone. And it happened again further down the line when I bought my first audiophile IEM, the Etymotic ER4P, which again was online talked about as being neutral, reviewed as neutral. And when I took it home, I didn't hear a bass emphasis, so I was like, yep, that's neutral. And I point this out only because this way of thinking about the sound signatures of playback devices is still present today, and honestly still extremely prominent today. It's not so prominent in the audiophile sphere. We've done a lot of collective education about things like measurements, things like targets. But in the pro audio sphere, this is absolutely still a prominent thing that a lot of people will make a purchasing decision based on. So with that, I actually do want to start talking about IEMs here, and I want to talk about, again, my first IEM, the Etymotic ER4P. When I got that thing home and started listening to it, what I got was a magnifying glass into the mid-range, a really upper mid-focused set with really not that much bass. I was hearing this as neutral, even though it wasn't, because again, I had just been conditioned by marketing, the talk online, my own expectations. I didn't hear this as a extremely mid-forward IEM. I heard it as neutral, just because it didn't have a bass boost. When comparing this back to back with the reference, it's so interesting because I can still understand why someone would find the Etymotic sound signature appealing. Again, that magnifying glass into the mid-range just lets you unpack so much texture and intensity. Now, sound quality aside, one of the biggest issues with the sound profile that Etymotic arrived at was that it was kind of at odds with the speaker literature, and as we would see as time went on, also kind of at odds with the headphone literature, and as we would see further down the line, also at odds with the IEM literature. Now, when I mention the literature, what I'm talking about is listener preference research, where people are either given some speakers to listen to or some headphones to listen to, and they get to choose what they prefer most. Now, the speaker and headphone literature has some important differences, but they also have some very interesting commonalities that I want to touch on here before we move forward. The first is that people tend to prefer more bass and less treble than a strictly flat response. So if you have a speaker in your room and you EQ it flat, that's likely to sound quite bright to most people. 2, people actually prefer similar corrections to flat in speakers and headphones. So the same rough distance between bass and treble is preferred between speakers and headphones. And 3, and arguably the most important for what I want to talk about going forward, is that in all of these tests, neutral and good are the same. What people rated as good sounding, they also rated as sounding the most neutral of any of the options tested. And this is really important, not only because it meant we could just target neutral as something that will likely sound good for people, but it meant that we didn't have to do all of this guessing about what good sound would actually be. We could just approximate the sound of speakers with the right amount of bass to treble delta and probably get something that sounds good to a majority of people. And this brings us to 2016, where Harman International starts publishing their IEM listener preference research, and this research produces arguably the first real competition to Etymotic's idea of neutral, which again had been widely accepted up to that point. In 2016, they did some testing to find out what kind of elevations of bass people preferred. In 2017, they tested a target based on what they arrived at in 2016 and tested that against a few other types of signature that were commonly found in the market. And in 2019, they had kind of refined what they arrived at in 2017 as the most preferred target. And at the end of this years-long research effort, we got the Harman 2019 target, which looked quite a bit different than the Etymotic target. It was a lot more bass and treble focused with large bass and treble elevations and not quite as mid-range focused as the Etymotic house sound. And because this 2019 target was backed by at least some level of listener preference research, a lot of people adopted it in earnest, either as kind of just a reference target to use that a lot of people would be familiar with, but a lot of people also adopted it as what good looked like, what neutral looked like, what would be most likely to be heard as good or neutral for the average person. And due to the confidence that this new target instilled both in the more science-based part of the community as well as the more consumption-focused part of the community, manufacturers followed suit and started offering things that were more similar to this target in hopes that it would result in as wide a potential consumer base as possible, and ideally more sales. But I actually think the confidence instilled by this target in consumers was actually more important than the way it actually sounded to people. I remember buying the Samsung Galaxy Buds Plus, which at this point Samsung had already acquired Harman and was taking their research seriously and tuning their products to it. And I remember buying the Buds Plus and thinking, oh wow, this is extremely V-shaped. But I just kind of sucked it up and got used to it because I was like, oh, that's what good sounds like, apparently. Or that's what music is supposed to sound like, apparently. You live, you listen, and you learn. The one thing I want to call attention to here is that the IEM target was initially based on the headphone target that they had already arrived at in prior studies. However, because the ear simulator they used was meaningfully inaccurate in the mid-range relative to an actual human ear, that meant that the target itself had a much less warm and accurate mid-range tuning. It had less in the low mid-range and more in the upper mid-range. So it had this bass forward, treble forward, lower mid-range recessed signature that, if you compared it to the results arrived at in the headphone or speaker preference research, was meaningfully different. Now, there were other things that the community kind of fixated on, mostly the lower treble in the 3 to 8 kilohertz region being quite emphasized, and as a result being quite harsh for some people. And as a result, we got our next potential competitor for a neutral sound signature, and that was Crinical's IEF 2020 neutral target. Really caught fire in the community, and we started to see a crapload of products tuned to this target. And there are a few reasons for that. One, Crinical was a very prominent reviewer. Everyone paid attention to what he had to say when it came to IEMs and their sound quality, and he just knew a lot about IEMs. No one had heard or measured more IEMs than he had, but also the fact that his target was less aggressive in the low treble was, I think, refreshing to a lot of people who had had issues with that aspect of Harman's target. But this IEF 2020 target, despite fixing a lot of what people disliked about the Harman 2019 target, still had plenty of issues. It, like most, if not all, reviewer targets that followed, are based loosely on the EQ'd response of IEMs that Crinical liked. This means any idiosyncrasies of the IEMs of the time that aren't noticed as an idiosyncrasy are then baked into the target. And that's absolutely what happened with this target, specifically in the 1 to 2 kilohertz region. Now, another big issue with this target that some people may not say was an issue, but I actually think was a big problem, Crinical opted not to include a bass shelf or a bass elevation of some kind in the target. Instead, his messaging kind of reflected that people should take this target as a way to guide the mid-range and the treble, and they should add the kind of bass boost they want on top of that. And I understand why some people would think this is a good idea or defensible. People have different bass preferences, and this was shown in the listener preference research done by Harman. It made sense that people should, instead of just following one dude's target, dictate that on their own. However, I think an important negative externality of this is that it inculcated the expectation that neutral was something different than what people would ultimately prefer. Because any IEM that was tuned to this target was basically this target with a bass boost, which meant what people liked was not what people were talking about as neutral. They liked neutral plus bass boost. And this started a whole years-long stretch of the review and evaluative method of these products being talked about such that neutral was not necessarily likable, but neutral plus bass boost was good. And yeah, I'm gonna be honest, this is incredibly frustrating because what we know from the years of speaker and headphone literature is that what people hear as good is also what they identify as neutral. And unfortunately, this IEF neutral 2020 target did inculcate the expectation that neutral would not be sufficiently good for people. It gave that expectation to consumers, reviewers, and manufacturers, and that is baggage that still remains with all of those groups. And I need to be clear here, neutral plus bass boost, if neutral is IEF neutral 2020, sounds way better than just IEF neutral 2020 with no bass boost. And I think that's why a lot of people actually latched onto it as a target. If used the proper way, as Crinical would have intended, it actually did produce a fairly balanced response. Now, I'm saying balanced, not neutral, because they're different. What IEF neutral 2020 plus bass boost did was it balanced a bunch of competing colorations in a way that did produce something that made sense and sounded at least like the parts weren't overpowering each other too much. So now I want to talk about the Truthier X Crinical Zero Red, because that's what I kind of regard as the logical conclusion of the neutral plus bass boost era. Crin, yeah, basically just tuned that IEM perfectly to his own target and then added a bass boost that made sense. And as a result, the IEM was pretty solid. Like, it's not a neutral IEM, but it is a nice balance of colorations where the forward upper mid-range is balanced by a bass shelf, and they work together to produce bass that is both forward and full sounding, as well as exciting and vivid, and a lot of people liked it, and it was really cheap, so a bunch of people could buy it. So it was extremely popular, but when you compare it back to the reference, the difference between Red and reference is that Red is very clearly a balance of colorations that will work really well for some music, but won't work well for other music, while reference is instead something that only really has very, very minor colorations, and as a result doesn't really imprint too much of its own character on any of the music you throw at it. So yes, reference sounds better than the Truthier Zero Red, but it also sounds better than basically any of the other IEMs that would have been neutral plus bass boost when evaluated against IEF neutral 2020. So now we have to skip forward to 2023, where the IEM market kind of underwent a bit of a shakeup. The introduction of the Brüel Care 5128, a new, way more accurate and human-like hearing simulator used for measuring IEMs, was introduced, and it kind of revealed the issues with both the Harman target and the IEF neutral target. And this threw us into a bit of a Wild West period where it was pretty unclear what we were actually supposed to be aiming for. But there were some efforts, both on our parts as well as other community members like Joel Merrifield, to kind of understand what kind of target response with this new fixture would actually make the most sense for people. In this time period, we started using a methodology where we used a diffuse field HRTF of the test fixture with a downslope to kind of emulate what a good flat speaker would do when put into a room, because when you do that, they downslope and then people say it sounds good because they don't actually like flat in-room speakers. Joel introduced their JM1 diffuse field HRTF, which instead of using the rig HRTF, which we know to be quite a bit brighter than the average human HRTF, and therefore would produce something that's brighter than the average human expects, incorporated the outer ear effects of actual humans. So it got us a little bit closer to the ideal of what an actual human being would expect as neutral when listening to these things. While these things were being worked on at this time period, they were far from being widely accepted, certainly not as universally accepted as something like the Harman target or like CrinE's IEF neutral 2020 target. But importantly, around this time, a few IEMs came out that started getting a lot of hype, both because they just sounded very good, but also because if you evaluated them against these newer targets for the new fixture, they actually looked quite a bit better than most of the old IEMs that people previously thought were neutral, but actually weren't. And those IEMs were the Subtonic Storm and the CrinEar Mega 5 EST. Now, the Storm, if you follow any IEM content at all, you probably know about it. It's a $6,000 IEM, widely regarded as pretty much the best IEM in the world. And then the CrinEar Mega 5 EST started being talked about a little bit after Storm's release, and was talked about mostly because it measured somewhat similarly to the Storm in terms of its overall tonal balance. Now, to be clear, they actually sound quite different, but this didn't stop people from comparing them, and importantly, both of them got a lot of praise. And when I say a lot of praise, again, Subtonic Storm, widely talked about as the best IEM in the world. Mega 5 EST was kind of indicative of this new tuning actually being a good thing because a lot of people heard it and liked how it sounded. And when it comes to what manufacturers pay attention to, what they pay attention to is sales and marketing and reviewer hype. They saw those things doing well and said, oh, we should try to do that. And thus began the era of what we call new meta. Now, this term new meta, as coined by Super Review, was not so much meant to be an indicator of neutral or ideal. It was more so a way to group these new products that were coming out that seemed to adhere well enough to the new targets that were kind of being talked about in spaces like Discord. And those products were the CrinEar Mega 5 EST, the Moondrop Dusk DSP with its default preset, and the Dunu DaVinci. And these are three IEMs that, yes, started this new meta wave, I think, concurrently, but they also kind of had similar issues, and those issues kind of persisted until basically now. While yes, I could wax poetic about the differences between the Reference and the Mega 5 EST, the Dusk DSP, the DaVinci, the CrinEars KE4, CrinEar Daybreak, the CrinEar Meta. The reality is that all of these new meta sets have basically the same weaknesses and downsides versus the Reference. So I'm gonna just talk about all of them all at once right now. What the Reference does well is understand that the best parts of all the IEMs I just mentioned has been the mid-range. But all of them have too much bass and treble to actually let that mid-range have a voice. So Reference has less bass and treble. It's not a mid-forward set like the Etymotic ER4 series or anything like that, because that's not neutral. What we want is something that balances a neutral mid-range with the appropriate amount of bass and the appropriate amount of treble. And that's what Reference does that none of the other ones do. All in all, what this has resulted in is in new meta being kind of a misnomer. Meta is kind of meant to imply that it's like a most efficient tactic available, or that it's something that is worth targeting as the best thing for the widest variety of people. But the reality, this new meta style of tuning is not neutral. It is, if anything, holdover baggage from the last era, from the IEF neutral 2020 era. What I mean by that is when the IEF neutral 2020 target indicated to consumers, reviewers, and manufacturers that neutral was not sufficient for people, that they wanted neutral plus bass boost, regardless of the fact that it wasn't actually neutral, manufacturers absorbed that. And it meant that when a new neutral target came around that didn't seem to have any pronounced or distinct bass boost, they thought, oh, okay, so we're just going to slap another bass shelf on this like we did with the last neutral target. And people will like that because people don't like neutral. They like neutral plus bass boost. And when they did that, because the new shaping of the mid-range is, yes, more natural, but also more warm relative to the old style of mid-range, it meant that adding a bass boost on top of it, the signature was just too warm. So you had to add upper treble too. Instead of something like the IEF neutral 2020 plus bass boost paradigm, where you have this colored mid-range and then the mid-range is offset and balanced by the bass and treble colorations, you got what was essentially a mid-range that didn't need balancing by colorations with a bunch of colorations stacked on top of it. So now I want to get into the next phase, which is where we are currently. And now obviously I need to disclose my biases because I actually think the first IEM that ushered in this new era of, well, bass and treble just not being ill-fitting with the mid-range was the CrinEar Pure. Yes, I tuned it. It didn't come out perfect. There are absolutely things I would still change about it given the chance. But I do still think regardless that it is the first IEM I've encountered in this modern new meta era where the bass wasn't completely overshadowing the mid-range. But it's worth saying this was only kind of a gesture towards the beginning, if anything, because Pure is still pretty imperfect. Like, it has a little bit too much warmth in the bass and low mid-range, but also it has this mid-treble spike that's pretty punishing, and we weren't able to control this, which is how we were kind of able to justify a little bit extra warmth. If that warmth wasn't there, this peak probably would have been more noticeable and more harsh to people. And yeah, when compared to the reference just kind of bodies it. It is a more just top to bottom, neutral, uncolored, plain water presentation that sounds much better with a variety of music than Pure does. Pure has some things where it really does sound kind of stuffy and congested, whereas Reference really never has that issue at all. If anything, it leans a little bit too much towards the other side where it's a little bit more clarity focused than pure neutral probably would be. But dollars to donuts, I prefer Reference, and I do think most people are probably going to prefer Reference too, because it's got more intensity, it's got more flair, but it's also more neutral, and it's kind of a great example of how more neutral can be more fun too. Now that brings us to the end of this lineup where we have to talk about the Prisma Lumen. Yes, they are very differently priced. Lumen is, I think, 4 times more expensive, but they're going to be compared a lot because they were both tuned with very similar goals in mind, that being a downsloped population average diffuse field response. And they were both aiming for something maximally neutral and maximally likable by the widest group of people. I think they both achieve it. Like, frankly, I don't think the difference between them is so huge that someone will hate one but love the other. But I do think the difference is big enough to discern a discrete preference between one and the other. And I do still prefer the Lumen. As said, the Reference is just a little bit, a hair tilted towards clarity versus true neutral. Lumen tilts just a little bit more towards warmth and density. And if I had to choose one or the other, it would be Lumen. It would be the more forgiving, thick sounding, punchy sounding set between the two of them. That is all to say, they are very close. However, there are a few specific differences that I want to touch on. Lumen does have a little bit more bass than I would call strictly neutral, and I do actually prefer Reference's bass level here. However, because Reference scoops out a little bit of that upper bass, lower mid-range area relative to what Lumen has, I actually feel like Lumen's bass integrates better with its mid-range. It has less of a distinct kind of drop-off in the upper bass that I actually find just makes things sound a little bit more coherent. Reference has this quality where male vocals and snare drums and guitar cabinets and stuff like that can sound just a hair thinned. And it's actually because of what else is going on in the mid-range here, where there is a very slight 1 to 1.5 kilohertz elevation on Reference that Lumen doesn't have. And Lumen, again, just sounds more accurate as well as kind of just sweeter in the mid-range because of it. In my normal listening, it's not really that big of an issue, but when comparing it to the Lumen, it does kind of shock me how much I prefer the Lumen's mid-range. I actually do think most people should probably still start with Reference. It's just so much less expensive. It has more ear tips as well, which kind of lets you really get an understanding of what kind of treble approach you're looking for. If you want something darker, you can go with the short wide tips. If you want something a little bit more filled in and brighter, you could go with the standard tips. So in a move that will probably surprise no one, because I already reviewed the Reference positively, I fully recommend the Reference, not only as an IEM that sounds great, but as an IEM that really does give people a chance to hear neutral in a way that they absolutely did not with the new meta, IEF 2020 neutral plus bass boost, the Harman target, or Etymotic's approach to neutral, which was very mid-forward. It is, along with Lumen, an indicator of the fact that we have finally arrived at the beginning of neutral IEMs existing. And I want to leave you guys with one more thought here. If you're one of those people who says things like neutral is boring, or neutral is bad, or this is too neutral for me, I implore you to understand listener preference research has indicated to us that good and neutral are the same thing. I think the problem is that you haven't heard your version of neutral yet. And this is undoubtedly because what Etymotic said was neutral, what Harman said was neutral, what IEF Neutral 2020 said was neutral, and what New Meta said was neutral. All of these things were not really neutral. And also, it's completely within the realm of possibility that neither Lumen nor Reference is actually your version of neutral. But I do think it offers the best starting point to jump off from and say, okay, I've heard this is what it's missing, and once I fix that, it will sound good. Because then that gives you an idea of what your neutral will look like and will sound like. And if you're one of those people that wants to try Reference but doesn't want to commit fully to the purchase because you don't know if you'll like it because you've never heard neutral before, I would highly recommend just buying it on headphones.com because they have a 365-day return policy. That means if you buy it, you can take a long time testing it and still return it after the fact if you're less than pleased with it. And obviously, they support this channel, they make all of this content possible, so by doing so, you would also be supporting us. But also, if you want to support us, there's actually another way to do that, which is the YouTube membership program, which is a recent thing we started doing where you can pay $5 a month to get some exclusive benefits like access to member exclusive live streams and cute little avatars next to your name in comment sections and live chats. But also, unlike buying headphones on headphones.com, if you get a YouTube membership, all of your money goes to the content team and the content budget directly. It's a 50-50 split between us and the budget. And what this means is that if you're one of those people that wants to support us and likes what we do, but doesn't want to buy headphones or IEMs at full retail price on headphones.com, you can do that now. And it's actually a much more direct way to support us. That money will be used, yes, to feed ourselves and pay rent and stuff like that, but it will also be used for the content budget, which is for things like going to can jams, buying headphones to review, and buying measurement gear if we need more of that. So if you want to support all that, definitely consider the YouTube membership too. All right, that's been enough from me. Y'all get out of here and have a good rest of your day. Later.